A spike in coronavirus cases is forcing some countries in Europe to go back into lockdown. In England, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has introduced a three-tier system, each with a certain level of restrictions. They range from a ban on socializing with people from other households to closing bars and restaurants. In France, residents have been placed under a curfew and are required to stay home between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. For more on this now, let's bring in CBS News' foreign correspondent, Imtiaz Tyab. Imtiaz, exactly why are parts of Europe seeing a resurgence in COVID-19 cases? Which countries are also seeing the biggest increases?
Hey, Lana, good to talk to you. Well, the short answer is lockdown measures were eased in many countries across the continent during the summer months as nations, of course, tried to revive their economies, but according to health officials, people just weren't following social distancing guidelines. They weren't wearing masks. And in some cases, it has to be said that in individual nations, they haven't been exactly as clear as they could have been to the public in terms of their own guidance on how to slow the spread of the virus. Now, at the moment, there are 11 European countries, including France, Germany, and Italy, who have seen their highest surge of new daily coronavirus infections. And in the past 24 hours, we've seen cases spike right across the continent in what's being called a second wave.
Well, how do these new lockdowns and restrictions actually compare to the ones that were implemented in the spring?
Good question. And a pretty complicated answer. Now, nearly every nation is approaching this differently. So unlike earlier this year, when many countries imposed sweeping lockdowns, much of the world did as well, what we're seeing now is something kind of different. We're seeing lockdowns that are targeted in certain regions. So, as we've been saying, for example, here in Britain, the north of the country is seeing pretty tight lockdowns. While here in London, there have been new restrictions, but they're just not quite as strict. It's part of that three-tier system you mentioned in the introduction as these infections continue to rise. Now, contrast that with the Czech Republic, for example. This country currently has the worst infection record in Europe. It's introduced a state of emergency this month, followed by a series of tight restrictions, including mandatory mask wearing in public and the shutting down of all pubs and restaurants. But it's really just underscores how no nation is doing the same thing, but all are trying to do the same thing, which is to contain these outbreaks.
Well, some countries are also reporting an increase in hospitalizations and the number of patients in intensive care units. Can you talk to us a little bit about the potential strain this spike could have on the hospital systems across Europe?
Yeah, we got to remember that these are healthcare systems that are already exhausted from months and months of treating COVID patients. And the concern is if we see more infections, particularly in vulnerable groups like the elderly, we may witness something very similar yet again. Really horrifying scenes of so many sick people suffering from this virus and sadly, in some cases, losing their lives. Now, at this very moment, we're already seeing ICU beds filling up, and there are dire warnings that they could be full in just a few months' time. Lana.
Well, one thing that is obviously very important in terms of what happens in Europe is what's going to affect the U.S. economy, as well as many of the world's economies are struggling to recover due to the pandemic, with things like restaurants, bars, and movie theaters affected by these new restrictions, not to mention manufacturing and other items. What impact could this have on Europe's economy and fundamentally on the U.S. economy as well?
For sure. The economy is one of the big factors here. Of course, people's health and the safety of everyone is paramount, but the reality is it has a huge impact on the economy. And frankly, the forecast isn't good. As we've been saying, important sectors like tourism, food and drink, retail, huge pillars of many European economies have been so badly affected this year. And that, frankly, isn't going to get better as we see these infections spike more and more. And of course, more and more restrictions are being put in place. Now, as we've also been saying, a lot of governments had been spending a lot of money on social programs to help those impacted by the virus. They gave people who had to be furloughed parts of their income. They also gave money to businesses and industries and sectors to try to keep them afloat. But many analysts say that it's unlikely that we're going to see the kind of support that governments have been able to do in the past happen again. And of course, the knock-on effect to that are obviously regular people and by extension, the wider economy, which some are describing as potentially catastrophic.
Well, flu season is quickly approaching. So how are countries there in Europe preparing to handle that dual situation? And is there anything that we can learn about that?
Hey, the short answer is get a flu shot. That's really what they're telling people. But of course, the concern is that when hospitals are not only dealing with COVID-19 and increasing numbers of cases, the concern is as this cold and flu season really starts to bite, that they're going to be struggling with both of this. And this is going to put an enormous strain on these already strained healthcare systems. There's been a lot of emphasis, as we've been saying, to get flu shots, but of course, asking people to socially distance, wear a mask, wash their hands, and of course stay at home as much as they can. Now these are guidances, but as we've been saying, in many European countries, these are now becoming rules that are put in place. Various countries and indeed various regions of certain countries are imposing lockdown measures of various levels of strength, if you will. But the genuine concern is that these European nations, many European nations, are just not prepared for what we're seeing here, which is this second wave. And it's something that we're clearly in the grips of. Until these countries can get a hold of it, the concern is that things are only going to get a lot worse. Lana.
All right, Imtiaz Tyab, thank you.